All right, hello, and welcome to Book Talks, a series of conversations with authors about their books, hosted by Barber Library. So my name is Michelle Spomer, and I'm the director of the library, and Tisha Wu is in the back there. She's our user services librarian. So our author today is Dr. Will Adams. He will be having a conversation with Dr. Roger Owens about his book, A Wild and Sacred Call, Nature, Psyche, Spirit, published by SUNY Press. But before we start, I have some housekeeping matters to cover. First, we will post bookshop.org and Amazon links in the chat, and those of you who are here can get those from us as well. For those of you who want to buy Dr. Adams' book online. Dr. Adams has also brought some books, correct? Mm-hmm. Yeah, which are $25 a piece, so you can pay with cash, check, or Venmo. Of course, those of you who are local could come to Barber Library and check out the book if you have a library account, and a library account is available to anyone who is looking for a small fee. Also, we will post a link to an online subject guide developed for this book talk, which includes books, journal articles, and websites that will help you explore this and related topics. This excellent guide was created by Tisha. There's also a curated display of books upstairs that you can peruse after the book talk, as well as, do we have book bibliographies? Okay. We will also have bibliographies that you can pick up and take with you. And for those of you online, this bibliography is available through the online subject guide, so you'll have access to that too. And for those of you interested in more information about our two conversation partners, links to their faculty pages will also be provided. That's a lot of links. Okay, so please be aware that this book talk is going to be recorded and then posted on the book talk page in the library website. You may want, for those of you online, you may want to view the live transcription during the book talk, which you can see by clicking the live transcription button at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions that you would like to ask, we invite you to do this throughout the conversation by clicking on the Q&A button, also at the bottom of your screen. And those of you who are here, there will be roughly a 10-minute Q&A session at the end. So think about your questions all the way through too. Lastly, I'd like to thank our communication staff, Melissa Logan and Robin Menard, who help us with advertising and registration. I'd also like to thank David Keyes for being our Book Talk ever helpful tech support person. And finally, thanks to Tisha Wu for creating wonderful educational resources as well as setting up this event. Okay, so now a bit more about our author. Dr. Will Adams completed a master's in psychology at West Georgia College and a PhD in clinical psychology at Duquesne University. He previously served as a clinical fellow in psychology at McLean Hospital, Harvard Medical School. He works as an associate professor of psychology at Duquesne University and as a psychotherapist and ecopsychologist in private practice. Dr. Adams' scholarship has appeared in the Humanistic Psychologist, Journal of Humanistic Psychology, Journal of Transpersonal Psychology, Revision, Journal of Phenomenology, I was going to mess this one up, Journal of Phenomenological Psychology, Existential Analysis, and Psychoanalysis in Contemporary Thought. He is a member of the editorial board of the Humanistic Psychologist and the Journal of Humanistic Psychology. Dr. Adams' special interests include ecopsychology, contemplative spirituality, and psychotherapy. His conversation partner, Dr. Roger Owens, is the Hugh Thompson Kerr Professor of Pastoral Theology here at PTS. Okay, now I'll turn it over to Dr. Adams and Dr. Owens.
Thank you all for being here this afternoon and being a part of this conversation. And mostly thank you, Will, for showing up and being open to this this conversation in a kind of new community for you and a new spot. So I'm really glad you're here.
Well, it's a great privilege to be here, really. It's a great joy. And thanks for inviting me. Thanks for hosting. Thanks to Tisha. She did a lot of work, I know. So, I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. Well, I just want us to dig right in. I mean, first, I loved reading this book. It's timely, it's rich, it's deep, it's poetic, it's really many wonderful things. And it's clearly an academic book. It was published by State University of New York Press. But when I was reading it, I couldn't help feeling like it's also kind of, I don't know if this is an edgy word, but a manifesto. Like you have something urgent you want to say that comes from a really deep place in you. So I just want to dive right in and say, what is it you're really trying to say in this book, and why is it so urgent to you?
Yeah, I appreciate you hearing that in the book. Yeah, because it's a scholarly book, but it's not a conventionally scholarly book. It's a labor of love. And I looked around, quite obvious, that nature is sending us a call, a really urgent call, partly by its just glory. I mean, what a day we have outside, right? The sun shining and, the rhododendrons blooming and the birds singing. That's one call.
Beautiful.
Exquisite, right? But other calls are like global warming.
Record high temperature.
Mass extinction of species, and maybe how hot it is today. Mm-hmm. Yeah, who knows? Yeah. And poisoned environment, and those are the ones that catch our attention. But the other things are that we're losing our conscious contact with nature, our conscious contact. We're always in contact with nature, and I should say the rest of nature, because we too are nature. Right? But we're losing our conscious contact with the rest of nature. If you don't have conscious contact, you don't have any source of nourishment and healing and growth on the one hand, but you don't have any source of care, compassion, justice. So there's a phenomenon called nature deficit disorder, coined by a journalist, Richard Louv, and more our lives are deprived of this conscious contact. And so I looked around and said, yeah, nature's sending us this wild and sacred call. And I wanted to respond as best I could. And I do it in the whole of my life, but I also write, never a book yet, until now. But I thought, it has to come in the book also. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In your own life, how have you heard the call? Like, where did this come from for you?
I loved being in contact with the natural world when I was a kid, playing in the woods, climbing trees, hiding, just wandering, listening to the birds. It also came when I was living in West Virginia. I lived in West Virginia, a glorious mountain community for 8 years. Spectacular. And I grew up in North Carolina. My first memories are in the Appalachian Mountains. And so when I was in West Virginia, I really felt like, in my bones, in my blood, that I was home in a way. And it's one of the most glorious ecosystems in the world, one of the most diverse. But not far away, they were destroying mountains with so-called mountaintop removal mining, but it's really mountain range annihilation mining, because they're just wiping out entire mountain ranges for coal. And both of those things, the glory, the beauty of West Virginia, and also the ravaging, the plundering, deeply sparked that call.
Yeah. So you saw both of these things up close, right? The at-homeness in nature, and also the destruction that comes from this alienation from nature.
That's right. That's right. And I'm glad you added that, because the destruction comes not because of evil exactly. It comes from alienation. Exactly what you just said. Alienation, separation, which is rooted in a profound confusion about who we are, about who others are, what this. what this natural world is.
We're gonna let the noise die down back there a little bit.
Sorry. There we go.
So I want to hang out with this sense of kind of urgency. I mean, mountaintop removal, or what did you call it? Annihilation?
Mountain range annihilation. Because removing a top of a mountain, it doesn't sound so horrible. But if you've ever been to a mountain range annihilation site, you see that they're destroying whole mountains, whole mountain ranges with massive explosives and huge machinery. And I can tell you some stories. There's some stories I included here, right?
Yeah, right. So I'm thinking about how urgent and kind of global this concern is, and yet you begin the book with a really sweet story and a picture. Maybe I could show you. I guess the folks at home wouldn't be able to see the picture, but it's kind of a blurry picture right here of Will's son as a toddler looking out a plate glass window into the eyes of a fawn who is clearly returning his gaze. Yeah. And I was just caught by the way there's this big concern, and you begin with this very particular moment, and they come up many times in the book, these particular encounters, these kind of almost small conversations that happened. And I just wanted you to reflect on that. Like, why begin there, and why are these kinds of moments, given the calamity that we're facing, so important along the way?
Yeah. Well, I think everything needs to be grounded in our own direct, intimate experience. That's the spirit of phenomenology. The awkward word that is big and fancy in a way, but it means like really careful attunement to lived experience. And this book is filled with a lot of theory in a way, phenomenology, psychoanalysis, Christian mysticism, Zen Buddhism. But what's prominent in the book are stories from everyday life, because that's where we live. That's where we live. And when I walked into my study a number of years ago and saw my little son Eli, looking out that window and gazing at that deer fawn, and that deer fawn gazing back, I thought, whoa. I snapped it real quick with a phone, in dark light. That's why it's blurry. But I think that the significance is so clear. I mean, here are two toddlers, from the neighborhood, drawn in mutual fascination into this contact with one another. And I just realized, of course, if we have these experiences, we're much more likely to act with care and much less likely to act with destructiveness, self-centeredness, unconsciousness in relation to the rest of nature. Yeah, and so all through the book, I try to bring up these ordinary life examples, because that's what it's all about. It's not about theory, it's not about concept. Any good theory, any good concept brings us back to everyday life.
Yeah. I mean, I love that, because phenomenology, it sounds like, if we'd said this was a book talk on phenomenology and nature, I think we would have an empty room here. But you're right. So that seems like a big theoretical approach, but in the book, it just shows up again and again in these stories of contact, and you use the language of conversation too with nature, or some. In fact, there's a line I really like. You talk about conscious, convivial contact with nature. Is that what your son was having right in that moment?
I think so, yeah. I think it really was conscious, convivial contact, yeah. I like that word convivial, and I guess it had been in my vocabulary from the past, but there's a wonderful eco-philosopher named David Abram, just like the world's premier eco-philosopher. And he's come to Duquesne a few times. I got to be friends with him. But he says, if I can remember exactly what he says, we are human only in contact and conviviality with what is not human.
I think you should say that again and dig it a little deeper for us.
Yeah. I want to make sure that I get David's words right, because he's a poet, and just I think I know where this is. Yeah, I think I got it right. We are human only in contact and conviviality with what is not human. And I mean, I've read his works and cited that line many times, but I have goosebumps when I hear that line, because what he's saying is that when we're not in that conscious contact, which more and more of us, more and more of the time, are not, right? We're losing something at the heart of what it is to be human, while simultaneously plundering the rest of nature. Yeah.
I mean, it's not uncommon to hear language that says we are human only insofar as we are in community or relationship with other humans. Right? But this is taking it a step further.
Yes, yes. It is, and yet it's only a step further because we've been so estranged from the natural world. I mean, the more than human natural world has been an integral community that we've been participants in for the whole history of humankind. And before, actually, in our pre-human ancestors, that we've always been in intimate rapport with the beings and presences of nature. They've been part of our community, and we've been members. But beginning, and it's hard to mark the time exactly.
Yeah, but
especially
what happened?
That's
where I'm going here.
I think we cultivated, maybe beginning in the modern era with the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. It's hard to mark because you could trace it further back. But we started developing this fantasy somehow that we were separate from the rest of nature, elevated above it. The rest of nature is lower than us, so-called lower animals, like that terrible phrase, right? Separation, elevation, devaluation, and then if you elevate yourself above and devalue another, then you feel entitled to exploit and dominate, right? And I think that's the basic structure of suffering. Separation, elevation, devaluation, domination.
Can you say more? What do you mean by that? The basic structure of suffering.
Well, I think when we construct separations that are our constructions that are actually illusory in some way, where there's no way we're separate from nature. I mean, even though we don't have conscious contact much anymore, we're always in contact with nature. Every single breath, every single bite, every single thing that we use in our life, and our very self, because we are nature. You can't be separate from what you are, but you can imagine that you're separate. And beginning especially with vengeance in the modern era, they became this ethos of humans being or presuming they're separate from the rest of nature. One exemplar of modernity is René Descartes, for example. He says we can be masters and possessors of nature. Francis Bacon, one of the sort of fathers of the scientific revolution, says, the function of science is to dominate nature. That's a paraphrase. Descartes, I think, is a quote. Right? So we start fantasizing that we can be separate, and that our health and well-being can be just human health, not dependent or interdependent with the rest of nature. And the more separate you are, it can give you a sense of safety for a moment, but it also leads you to be scared. Because what you're separate from, what you imagine that you're separate from becomes a threat. Right? And so you have to defend even more. And I make myself more separate, or I impose my will even more. And it's just a vicious circle. And we see this in relation to nature, but we see it in other aspects of our life. This is the structure of racism. This is the structure of sexism. One race above another and entitled to exploit. One gender above another, entitled to exploit. One country over another, one religion over another, one class over another. separation, elevation, devaluation, domination. It pervades our life, and it works internally too. There's aspects of ourself that we don't like. Ooh, I don't like that. I'm going to push that away and make it unconscious. It's a part of me that can dominate that. But of course, anything you push away, anything you separate that's not really separate, it's going to come back to bite you. You know, if you say, "Oh, I'm never angry," but "Oh, there's all these people around me that are really angry. What's wrong?" Well, the anger that I'm seeing is anger that I've disowned. But the same thing happens with nature. I think climate emergency, mass extinction, habitat destruction, toxic environments, biodiversity loss, all these maladies with nature are things that we've repressed coming back to haunt us. Freud called it the return of the repressed. You repress something, it's not going to go away. It's going to come back to haunt you.
Yeah. I mean, you just listed, like, there was a point in this early on, a half a paragraph that's just listing all of the destruction, the calamity that results from this alienation, that has a long history and development, and that's also related to colonialism and the development of ideologies of racial superiority. And I was just interested in the fact that there's almost a kind of lament in that, but you are insistent that we turn toward that. Like there was this almost an invitation, dwell with this for a little while, And in fact, at one place you say that you have to feel and trust our heartbreak. And I just would love to hear you reflect on that. What does it, feel and trust our heartbreak? When maybe some of us would like to skip that chapter and get on to something else, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think we're in an agonizing time in our relations with the rest of nature. And if we haven't really grieved, if we haven't really, cried deeply at least a few times, then I don't think we're noticing what's happening. Yeah. And if you don't notice what's happening, then you don't know how to respond skillfully. We're clearly in the midst of a certain kind of breakdown. Ecosystems are fraying, the world's, natural systems are becoming toxic and diminished, and there's lots of other unraveling happening as well, inseparable from our relations with nature. But the potential is that in facing that breakdown, that there can be a breakthrough. And psychotherapists know this really well. Patients come because their lives are breaking down. But it's a good thing that they're showing up, because that's the beginning of transformation. Yeah, and so if we face what's anguishing, we have a chance of listening to the message. Because if our hearts are breaking over species going extinct, or swaths of human populations having to migrate because of climate disruption, island territories are uninhabitable. If our hearts break there, then that's, even though it's painful, that's real wisdom and sanity. And if our hearts aren't breaking because of that, then we've blocked ourselves off. We separated ourselves even more.
Right.
Yeah. So it gives us a chance to respond consciously.
So the inability to look at that and grieve would be part of what you call the delusion. I'm separate. I can fix this technologically or build a colony on the moon. So I don't need to. I'm not part of what's broken or suffering here, right?
That's right. That's one version of that separation or dissociation. That's exactly right.
Yeah. I'd love to just step back a little bit, because I do want to hear a little bit more about the theory behind this, partly because the language of transpersonal psychology and ecopsychology, you've already talked a little bit about phenomenology, but at least here at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, we don't talk about that a lot. And I would just love to hear, like, what are those, and how do they inform how you're reading this situation?
Yeah. I'll start with transpersonal psychology. Transpersonal psychology is sometimes called spiritual psychology. And the world's spiritual traditions have been profoundly important for me. The two that I know the best, that are closer to me and my home, are the Christian contemplative mystical tradition and Buddhism, especially Zen Buddhism. And transpersonal psychology has not just tried, we're actually doing it, bring the wisdom of the great spiritual traditions into contemporary psychology. Because, I mean, we take psychology for granted these days, but psychology is a really young discipline. You know, it emerged in the late 1800s, basically. And before that, you couldn't have even majored in psychology if you had come to school in Pittsburgh or Boston or London or wherever, right? But of course, people were doing psychology before. They were asking questions about who am I? Who are these others? How do I live well? How do I love well? How do I address suffering? And I really started realizing that the spiritual traditions were kind of like indigenous psychologies that naturally sprung up in local communities and then broadened to address these, what we would often call psychological questions. You could call them philosophical questions or religious questions, but and so they were the indigenous psychologies, and the ones that had the greatest expertise were the mystics, the contemplatives, because they were sitting quietly and carefully attending to the workings of their heart and mind, right? That they were the great psychologists. So transpersonal psychology, beginning, I guess, about 40 years ago, realized that there was this immense wisdom, psychological or spiritual, maybe you don't even have to say which is which, in the great spiritual traditions, especially the contemplative traditions. And it took psychology a while to wake up to this. I mean, I talk about Freud's critique of religion, which I think he got significantly right up to a point, because there are shadow sides of religion, you know, life-inhibiting sides of religion. But he didn't see any life-enhancing versions of religion. And Freud was the most important psychologist for decades, you know. And psychology largely sort of just didn't understand.
But also, I mean, in terms of the transpersonal, I think from reading the book, I sense that, I mean, this would be probably overly simplistic, but psychology, at least in the first half of the 20th century, had the blinders of modernity and was living in that alienation, insofar as felt like it was dealing with an isolated self.
Yes.
And transpersonal psychology wants to say, you know, that's not going to really get us to healing and wholeness if you keep focusing on helping this isolated, separate self function better in the world. Is that?
Yeah, thanks for bringing me back to transpersonal psychology in particular. It's great to have a good conversation partner. So here's where you're right. And I'll just elaborate just a little bit. So the personal of transpersonal means our own distinctive, personal, individual, authentic sense of self, what we care about as unique individuals, what our distinctive values are, desires are, aspirations are. Who am I as a unique individual, skin-bounded self, right? And this is a real developmental accomplishment that's very important. It doesn't mean, you know, narrow self-centeredness. It really means growing into my unique sense of what I care about and how I want to live. And you know, children don't know this. It starts to really emerge in adolescence and in young adulthood. So that's a very important developmental accomplishment. And traditional psychology all through the 20th, most of the 20th century, really felt like developing that unique, authentic individual self was the pinnacle of development. Mm-hmm. And it is indeed an important developmental accomplishment, but transpersonal psychology, drawing from the spiritual traditions, say we can go even beyond that. And that's the trans in transpersonal. Trans, beyond personal, the personal. And it's an awareness that while never letting go of your unique individual self, that you're an inseparable participant in something that's infinitely deeper than your small, skin-bounded body-mind, right? And in classical spiritual language, that might be called God or the Tao. It could be called nature. It could even be like community. And there's different versions of having this experience of realizing that who you are goes beyond the boundaries of your skin-bounded self, without losing your skin-bounded self, but it goes beyond, and that you're an inseparable participant in something infinitely deeper.
I mean, and this kind of brings us back to those moments, those particular moments where you, because most of us aren't walking around all day long sensing this connection, but there are those moments where this kind of this personal sense of I and my separate self are relaxed into a greater sense. And you tell some stories. One of them I think was about being maybe in California, watching a hummingbird. Mm-hmm. I mean, how does that? I mean, does that connect with this? What transpersonal psychology is? Can you tell that story?
It does. Now, if we walked around really attuned to our unique, distinctive self, that's a pretty healthy way to walk around. So, but there is a deep.
We're all working on it.
We're all working on it, and we often walk around way more contracted than that, sort of with a really more selfish, self-centered, I, me, mine orientation, which is only even a more narrow version of that individual, self. But in certain moments, those boundaries between myself and the other, it becomes obvious that they're completely permeable, right? And I had this encounter with a hummingbird, where in an amazing but thoroughly ordinary, see, this is what's really important, way, I saw the hummingbird hovering over these flowers, and I started seeing actually the rapidly beating wings pushing the flower petals and the leaves of that plant down, and like back and forth, and somehow, I think by grace, maybe I was a little open, but by grace I could see this. I could actually see this happening, and I realized the hummingbird was doing this dance with the flowers, but that I was participating in that, and so was the plant, and so was the ground, and so was the ocean behind me, and that there was this just seamless dance going on. Mm-hmm. It was just beautiful. And then I said, okay, there's a lot of hummingbirds where I live in Pittsburgh. I'm going to watch when I go back to Pittsburgh. And I really looked carefully. After seeing, I'm sure, 1,000 hummingbirds in my life before that, I went back to Pittsburgh and said, I can see that here too. It's actually happening, right? So these experiences aren't experiences of the extraordinary. They're experiences of the completely ordinary, but with a sensitivity and a vividness that's always already available if we just shift into it.
Mm. And I love how, I think this is what you call the conversational nature of creation. And there's this sense that, as separate kind of egocentric beings, we think we probably have the first word. And you were talking about this responsiveness to this conversational nature of creation. And I remembered a line from the Quaker mystic Thomas Kelly, who said, all of our apparent initiative is already a response. And it was just that invitation. And I I appreciated that connection between this kind of like responsiveness to this conversation.
Yes. Yeah, that's a beautiful quote. I'll have to get that from you at some point. I think we've been encultured to feel like healthy living is like imposing our wishes and will on the world, asserting ourselves. And there's times to be assertive, for sure, right? But I think way more primarily we're responsive beings. Ultimately everything that emerges as us is emerging as a response to the gifts and challenges we've been given. I love this phenomenological philosopher, Emmanuel Levinas, who's an ethical philosopher, Lithuanian originally, but he lived in France. And he has a quote where he says something like, "The other is the first one on the scene," which is the opposite of, like you were saying. We feel like we have the first word. But our words and actions, in a way, always come in response to the call of others, response to the wild and sacred call, right? Now, we can turn that call into a defensive response where I impose my will and wishes. But we have the opportunity instead to listen to what that overture from the other is. Yeah, I really felt like that hummingbird in the bush was sending an overture. That hummingbird wasn't consciously or intentionally sending it to me, but there was an expression coming.
And part of your response to that was being more alert and attentive when you came back to your own surroundings and to your home. Yeah.
Right. That's right.
So you and I have a common interest in Thomas Merton, and so you have these kind of theoretical fields, disciplines, but then you related transpersonal psychology to the mystical traditions, but when you talk about the mystical traditions, there's something a little more personal there, it seems like, and you mentioned Zen Buddhism and Christian mysticism. And I want to just reflect with you a little bit about Thomas Merton, partly because I don't see many of those students here, but all of my students for a decade at the seminary, so that would be hundreds at this point, have had the really extraordinary pleasure of writing a paper on Thomas Merton's understanding of the true and false self.
Yeah.
And Merton, and he's probably one of the people in the 20th century that really made that language very popular in terms of spirituality, and almost common. And he says we come into the world as a false self, and we're shattered by an illusory self, and I think that language resonates with you. And I wonder if that, what you think he's talking about when he says the false self, and is it the same thing that you're talking about when you talk about the small, contracted, ego-centered way of being in the world?
Yeah, this is a very important matter, I think. It's a little complex, but I'll try to be clear. What psychology means, and leave out transpersonal for a moment, but what traditional psychology means by true self and false self is different than what the mystical traditions mean by true self and false self. So that description of an authentic, distinctive, I know my unique ways, my unique values. I know that, even though my parents or my friend have that value, then I can incorporate some of it, but I really see things differently. I can distinguish myself. I really know my authentic, distinctive self. In traditional psychology, that's called true self. And the false self would be not knowing that, or just falsely complying with someone else, unconsciously, uncritically, just incorporating some other one's values, perspectives, not really making our own choices. So that would be false self. This is traditional psychology, true self, false self. Okay, this is oversimplifying, but that small contracted I, me, mine, selfish, self-centered, supposedly self-sufficient, that would be false self in traditional psychology, okay? For the contemplative traditions, and I think this cuts across different spiritual traditions, the false self, even that authentic, distinctive, individual self, if it's imagined to be independent, autonomous, sovereign, self-sufficient, that would still be false self. Because you've forgotten or never realized that there's no way that you could even be without this deep communion with something that's infinitely deeper than yourself, right? And the discovery of a true self is a discovery that your deepest identity goes beyond your small separate self. That your self, most deeply, isn't even yours. Your self isn't even yours. It's, ultimately, it's like this great, unnameable mystery. You call it God, or the Tao, or life, or nature, or being. That's our deep self, true self.
Yeah. I mean, you could paraphrase, so you like that Augustine quote, if you understand it as not God. But you could say, in that mystical sense, you could say the same thing about your true self.
Yes.
If you have found your true self, as if it's something I've established, I've figured it out,
yes.
It's not your true self.
It's not your true self, because it goes infinitely deep. Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, we know the feeling I'm tempted to do something experiential, but well, quickly. First of all, if I would say, who are you? And you come up with some answers, who are you? Come up with some answers, who are you? Like, if we had time, we could do this for 10, 20, 30 minutes, and earnestly inquiring. But I said it a few times, a few answers probably came up, right? Well, is any of those answers sufficient? No, of course not. Because any name, any characteristic is only part of who you are. Nothing, it's not sufficient, right? And we know the terrible feeling when people kind of say, oh, I got your number. I know what you're like. I know you're this way, you're that way. When we're treated that way, it feels terrible. It feels terrible. So we know, in a certain way, who we are goes infinitely deeper. And I told a story the other day. There's a great Zen koan that a disciple of Bodhidharma, who was a famous Indian monk who brought Buddhism to China, integrated with Taoism. This disciple says, Master, I've searched and searched, and I can't find, he calls it mind, but this means true self. I've searched and searched, and I just, my mind is not at rest. And Bodhidharma says, okay, go away and search for your mind, or true self, and bring it to me. And the student goes away, for we don't know how long, but probably like weeks, months, maybe even years, and finally comes back to Bodhidharma and says, Master, I've searched and searched and I can't find it. And Bodhidharma says, well, I put it to rest. I've put your mind to rest. And one of the points, and this is not anything like answering the koan, this is a practice, with a teacher. So I'm not giving you the answer to the koan. But Wike, the student, went away, and it's not that he didn't find anything. He found that there was nothing specific, objective, reifiable that he could find to say, that's really myself, right? And when he sees this, he starts to realize that he goes infinitely deep, right? And if we go infinitely deep, that's another name for the great mystery.
Yeah.
Infinity.
Right, and waking up to this reality, or coming out of that delusion, is for you is really key, a key aspect of what you might call addressing the calamity we've started with. Right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. It's waking up. It's in a way, it's so very simple, but we have to put it into practice. Waking up to the realization that we can never, ever be separate. We can never, ever be separate from the rest of nature. We can't be separate from the earth. We can't be separate from whatever the great mystery is. Let's call it God.
Yeah.
And as long as we feel like we're separate, we're in hell. Because that sense of separation is a delusion. And it sponsors paranoia and greed. Our ordinary habitual sense of being separate sponsors a low-grade paranoia. I got to get everything for myself, and I got to keep them from getting it, right? And, well, the other side of that is greed. More and more for myself.
Yeah. So, I want to kind of ask, like, what next? Like, what do we do? And I'm imagining someone saying, we've talked about annihilating mountains, global climate change. How is appreciating a hummingbird and waking up to the fact that I'm not separate from it? How's that, like, what's next? How does this lead us to, like, making a difference?
Yeah. I think largely what's next is to have conversations like this, and the conversation we're going to have with the folks in a minute, right? Like, we're in this together, not just with each other, but for each other. I think we've got to realize that health and well-being and aliveness can't be just mine alone or my tribe. Me and my tribe, that's the orientation that dominates much of our lives these days. Whether it's the tribe of my political party or the tribe of my species, right? So I really, you've invoked conversation a few times. I think conversation is both the path and the fruit. How do you reach a convivial life, a convivial culture, a convivial world? Well, the fruit would be careful, collaborative, respectful. And conversation means participation also, not just words, right? But how do you get there? Well, in conversation with other humans, but also with the more than human, right? So when I see a mountain range annihilation site, that site speaks to me. It speaks to me. And I try to offer the best response I can. If I see the glorious hummingbird, that speaks to me. And I try to offer the best response I can. And, that's what's happening in this very conversation.
Yeah.
It happens some in the book, I hope.
Yeah.
But that's what's happening in this conversation.
Yeah. Well, it's a lovely conversation, and like I said, I find the book inspiring, and I really appreciate what you've done here very much. There's only one question I'm told to ask, but I think it's a very interesting question because I write too, and sometimes folks who come to these they're just curious, like, what was your process writing this book? Especially that you name it's not a conventionally academic book. It's clearly an academic book, but not conventionally academic. And when you read it, you get this sense, this comes from a very deep well. This isn't, you can write a conventionally academic book in a couple of years, that's an exercise and it gets out there, but this comes from a different place. So just say for a minute or two, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Yeah. I didn't want to write a book about nature. I wanted to write a book that invited readers into an experience that would foster the kind of transformation of consciousness and culture that we so direly need. And when I shared this book early on, a couple of different reviewers independently said the book enacts the healing that it elucidates. And I'm so glad that they saw this. This was really it for me. How can I I didn't want my words to like represent something out there only. Of course, I do want that, but I wanted the words to actually create some new, revelatory, transformative experience. And as I was doing that, I realized that in a certain way, it wasn't me writing the book. At least not me in my ordinary self. Because I realized that in some way, nature was coming through me. And I was doing my best to give it voice. And so was, so were St. John of the Cross, or Dogen, the Zen master, or Levinas, the philosopher I just cited, or
the Psalms,
and the Psalms, and St. Paul and Christ, and my children and my wife and my students. You were over there, and hummingbirds and white-tailed deer. Like somehow this was coming through me, and of course I was adding my own inflection. But I interviewed. I did a study a while ago that I actually never wrote up, and it ended up being in the book. But interviewed people that were doing Christian contemplative practice and working for the well-being of nature. And one of my participants, I call her Nora in the book, said, she talked about nursing the earth back to health. And she said, look, I don't know how many little blue gems there are out there. That's an image for the earth from space, I don't know how many little blue gems there are out there. But I know that I'm paraphrasing now, this little blue gem that we live in and on and as is calling for our care. We have to nurse it back to health. But then she said, we have to be careful because Earth is the real nurse. She could have also said God is the real nurse. Yeah, she was deep Christian contemplative. But Earth is the real nurse. Earth is the real healer. But at the same time, we humans, individually and collectively, are called to offer our best healing responses to the beauty and the maladies of Earth. And so I felt like this is the same thing in the book. In a way, Earth is the real writer. But it's coming through me, and I just did my best to offer what I could.
In a way, it's your response to the summons, and now we're being enfolded into that. So we thank you for it.
It was my best written response for the time being to that summons. Yeah.
Well, let's take about 10 minutes for some conversation, and let's start with, maybe go in the room, and then if there's one online, we'll check. So I saw a hand over here real quick, and we'll have a microphone so the folks online can hear your questions. Yeah.
Probably the best book talk I've ever heard. Thanks to both of you. Just really sparkled all the way through. You a couple times had a sentence in which God and nature were side by side and implicitly equated. I'm right there with you. My brother, a conservative Christian in the Southern Baptist tradition, is a light year from that and regards respect for nature even, or at least admiration for nature and the kinds of conversational relationships with nature that you've referred to as anathema to Christianity. Would you speak to that briefly?
Well, the first point is that there are these classic time-honored words, names, for the great unnameable mystery. God is one of those classic names. So is the Tao. So is nature, or being. Because we don't know what those certainly we don't know what those words refer to, but they don't refer to anything in a way. They don't refer to a particular thing, right? This is the St. Augustine quote that Roger cited. You know, St. Augustine says, you know, if you think you comprehend God, that's not it. Right? It's so all of these are kind of empty signifiers. I mean, they refer to some great mystery that's all-encompassing, all-pervading, all-permeating, omnipresent. And like when I say nature in the way that you pointed to, I'm not talking about mere biology. It's included, but it goes infinitely deeper than that. Oh, and I'll also add, like Roger picked up, our true self. That's another one of those names for the great unnameable, our true self. So these words aren't meant to represent something. They're meant to like release a charge that leads us to deeper exploration. It's not representing something. These words hold a charge, and to invoke them, you know, it releases that charge. And I don't know what God is. You know, I write in the book, you know, I mean, this is a funny thing for an ecopsychologist to say, I don't know what nature is. But I know that I am an expression of that. I could say, I don't know what God is, but I know I'm an expression of that. And I know I love that. And I know that I'm called to serve that. So that's what it comes down to me, not if the words are sort of accurate representations. So that's the first point. As far as our intimacy with nature being, and our care for nature being an anathema to certain versions of Christianity, I think it's misguided. I mean, there's some legacies that we have to overcome. You know, there's at least certain readings of the book of Genesis that, you know, make humans being dominant. But there are other readings, okay? But we can also turn to the teachings of Christ. You know, I mean, well, Christ says, you know, I am a vine and you are the branches. Okay. And when he says I, he doesn't mean his individual separate self, Jesus of Nazareth. He means God. God is the whole vine, and we are branches. Well, who are we to exclude trees and rivers and birds from those branches? That's madness. And in the Gospel of Thomas from the Gnostic Gospels, but I think at least some of that book is authentic teachings of Christ. Christ says, you know, lift up a stone, you will find me there. Cleave a piece of wood, you'll find me there. And me, again, doesn't mean Jesus as an individual self, it means God. Lift up a stone, you'll find God there. Cleave a piece of wood, you'll find God there. Everywhere. Mm-hmm. And if we saw God everywhere, I mean, this is really what the incarnation is about. If we saw God everywhere, in each other's faces, but in the face of that river and that tree and that mountain that's about to be destroyed in West Virginia, we would live differently. We wouldn't be destroying that mountain.
So we have an online question. Are there any online questions? What's that? Oh, we're going to let her have the last question if there's an online question.
Okay.
So, is there an online question?
Yes.
Okay, what's the online?
Okay. So this person asked, what are the needs and prospects for clinical work, such as counseling and social work, with people who are experiencing anxiety or depression as a result of climate and other environmental issues? So more of a practical question.
Yeah. It's hard to say it quickly, but here's where I would start. If you're a therapist and you have a patient that's anxious and sad about the state of nature and climate emergency, I would help them understand that their anxiousness and sadness is real wisdom, is real sanity, is deep care and compassion. That if they're not anxious and sad at times, then they've shut themselves down. Right? And I would talk with them about, we spent a little bit of time early on about how breakdown is a prelude to breakthrough. Right? So I would want them to appreciate that these aren't feelings just to get rid of. They're feelings to listen into deeply and honor and find a way to incorporate into healthy, skillful action that they don't have to take just by themselves. That they don't have to handle this by themselves. If they're in therapy with you, they're already in collaboration. They have an ally, right? But these feelings about the ravaging of nature, they're real feelings that need to be honored. And in the past, therapists have tended to say, oh, you're worried about nature. Well, you're really worried about that relationship that got ruptured when you were a child, You're really talking about how your dad, abused you or abandoned you or something, right? Well, if the dad abused and abandoned you, you got to explore that. But it doesn't mean that all of our concerns about nature are just displaced from other more human things. So I would honor the real concern about nature and let them know that this was a healthy response, but that they don't have to handle it all by themselves. That's the beginning.
Thanks, Bill. Last question. Well, this will be brief.
Okay. I believe our journey to be an authentic self is continual. It is never ending because of everything that happens. But I wonder to what extent we avoid participating in the authenticity of someone else when we separate from them, neglect them, and don't even value them. I watched a play called The Awakening in which a young man leaves a gang, and it was the valuing of his grandmother that eventually broke through to him. And I wonder how in our churches or any community there could be more opportunities to value what maybe we're afraid of or we ignore.
Indeed. Yeah, indeed. No, those are very sensitive comments. The great humanistic psychologist Abraham Maslow, who coined the term self-actualization, which has to do with authenticity, later in his life talked about self-actualizing, that it is an endless process, no doubt about it. But when we get confused and afraid, we play out that confusion and fear with people around us, and often by diminishing them, to give us a sense of security. And if we could learn that pain and anxiety and fear and confusion and being lost isn't necessarily a bad thing, but we can listen into it. We can listen into it and learn its messages and let its messages teach us, then we would be way less likely to be hurting the other person, right? We think pain is a bad thing. Pain's part of being human. And that pain includes fear and confusion, fear that I'm going to not be loved, fear my loved ones are going to abandon or shame me, our awareness of death, our dread of death, all of this. There's nothing wrong with that fear. I just think we have to learn to be scared, but not scared away.
Mm-hmm. Let's thank Will for being here and for his wisdom.
you to both of you, Dr. Adams and Dr. Owens, and thanks to all of you for joining us, and those of you online. For those of you here, please stay. Feel free to mingle, buy Dr. Adams' book, whatever you want to do. Thanks to all of you. Have a good night.
Thanks so much, folks. Yeah, we were able to touch on some important things, but I know it was all of the things like called for further conversation. So the ongoing conversation after we leave here, I feel heartened by.